Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this morning's Beef Brunch Educational Series webinar. My name is Brittany Zombrecker, and I will be hosting today. So our speaker for today is Mr. Lee Faulk. Lee is a livestock and forages agent in the Northwest region. He is housed out of the Hill Farm Research Station and coordinates our beef cattle programs in his region. So this morning, he will be wrapping up our series on cattle marketing by discussing how to add value to your calves. So I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So we will be muting your microphones. So we ask that you please keep them muted throughout the webinar. If you are joining us online through our Teams app, please enter your questions into the Q&A box at any time during the presentation. And if you're calling in, you may text your questions to me at 337-284-3392. Again, if you're calling in, you can text me any questions throughout the webinar, and that number is 337-284-3392. So in the interest of time, we will wait to answer questions until the end of the presentation. Okay, Lee, thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. So you should be able to unmute your microphone and then begin whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you so much, Brittany. Glad to be with you all here today. I'd like to take just a moment and say welcome to Brittany. She's joined our beef team as far as the LSU Ag Center Extension goes, and we're very grateful to have her. She's a professional extension agent and a valued addition to the team for sure. So I'm going to talk today about market options and adding value to calves. And I've got to give a little precursor, I guess, that some of what I'll be discussing has been brought up over the course of these past few video series. So some of it will be old news, and I'm going to try to go quickly over some of the stuff that has already been discussed. I was watching some of Tyler's presentation from last week, and it's really good information, really good content, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what he presented. So I'll try not to be too repetitive as we go through this. The presentation is going to be kind of broken up into two different categories. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on market options. And my purpose behind that is not to dissuade you from marketing your cattle through whatever channel you've been using, but rather to open your eyes to some other channels and some other avenues that you might be able to use to get your cattle sold. Because this is a business, folks, and if you don't treat it as a business and don't market your cattle in the most appropriate format to maximize profits, then that's not a very good business decision. So I'm a little rusty on technology, I must admit, so I'm going to try to go through this. I hope that everything works good and whatnot. And if you've sold any cattle in the last 6 months to a year, you'll realize how good this market truly has been, especially in the last 6 months in particular. Not only on calves, but on yearlings, cull cows, cull bulls. Everything has been fantastic. And folks, I just want to give you a little warning here before we even really get started. Don't forget the lessons of 2015. When we had those record high prices in 2014, and it made everybody a genius at marketing cattle. And a lot of us were forced to remember to relearn some lessons in 2015 when this market really tanked. Now, I'm not going to give any forecasting as to what I foresee happening. Dr. Guidry covered quite a bit on that on the cattle cycle, but I will say this. Things look good for the moment, and they look good going into next year, and I predict some decent prices for a good many months to come. Just don't forget those lessons. What goes up must come down, and that's ever so true in the markets. So when we talk about marketing cattle, I'll try to change slides. Here we go. There's essentially a great divide in cattle marketing, and that great divide is 50,000 pounds of like, type, and kind cattle. When I say like, type, and kind, I'm talking about uniform of one sex, similar weight, similar breeding, similar appearance, you name it. And so if we can achieve that 50,000 pounds of cattle, which is a semi-truck load, there are a lot more options available than to those of us that can't achieve 50,000 pounds, less than a semi-truck load. And really and truly, the cattle marketing in the last 10 years especially has really been based on those truckload lots. It puts those of us smaller producers kind of at a disadvantage. So if you want to stop and think about it, about how many head of cattle you truly need to make a truckload, it's quite a bit, folks, if you're a cow-calf operation. And so I set up just a brief scenario just to go through this, and you could argue some points with me one way or another, but and not to say that you wouldn't be right on those points. But we'll make a few assumptions, and assuming a cow-calf operation, and also that your conception and calf weaning percentage when you total is 85% of the cow herd. Also that half the crop will be steers, half will be heifers. That the cows calf during a defined breeding season, 90 days or less. You also assume that the producer plans on keeping 15% of heifers as replacements, which can vary operation to operation. Some farms that have a lot of older cows may try to keep more than that. If you've got a fairly young cow herd, it may be less. And we also are going to assume that the producer plans on weaning and selling the calves at 550 pounds. That's a pretty standard weaning weight. We try to shoot for a little higher, but a lot of times, such as during this drought that we've experienced this summer statewide, our weaning weights have suffered, and we may not be able to get quite to 550 pounds. May be struggling to stay in the high fives. But if we assume 550-pound weaning weight, then it's going to require either 91 head of steers or 91 head of heifers to make a load. So if we use those assumptions that I just mentioned, a producer or a farm would need a minimum of around 260 bred cows that have similar genetics and breeding and are calving around the same time. Now, if you weren't keeping replacement heifers, you could drop that number down to 215 head of cows. Now, but another thing that you could drop that number down is if you were weaning a heavier calf, or if you're keeping those calves past weaning and selling them as 700 pounders or 750 pounders, the number that it would take to make a load drops. But I want to bring this into perspective because according to the 2020 Ag Center Ag Summary data, the average herd in Louisiana is around 47 head of cows. So we're far short of what's needed for truckload calf sales. So going back to this great divide of cattle marketing, listed out all the options here, and I'm not going to say this is an all-inclusive list. There may be some other venues or channels that you can market cattle through, but we'll talk briefly about all these as we go through the presentation. On a semi-truck load, local auction market is always an option. Video, internet auctions, sales, board sales like Tyler referred to, retaining ownership through a feedlot, large regional auctions, private treaty sales, direct to consumer, direct to packer, cull cow sales. We won't spend a lot of time on that one because that's kind of a very specialized outlet for your cull cows that not a lot of producers utilize, but it is possible to sell truckloads, 50,000 pounds of cull cows directly to the packer and everything. So when we're talking about less than a load, that's most of what the farms in Louisiana produce. A couple of gooseneck loads a year of calves, and their natural home is our local auction markets. Of course, you can sell cattle private treaty when you have less than a load. You can sell direct to consumer. Internet sales are an option. Large regional auctions, I'll put a question mark behind this in our next topic, just because they may or may not be the best option. And cooperatives, we'll spend a little bit of time on that as well towards the end of the presentation. This is a rough map of our Louisiana livestock auction barns, okay? And so we have 7 in the state. We're very fortunate to have the number we have and the quality sale barn owners that we do have. I guess it's a function of age, but the older I get, the more I catch myself saying, I remember when. Well, when I look at this map, I remember when there were a whole lot more arrows, a whole lot more sale barns on this map, and I'm sure you do too if you spend any time in the cattle business in Louisiana. Folks, we've lost a lot of these sale barns, and a lot of these sale barns that have maintained and existed have grown in size. They've gotten to be larger. They handle more cattle weekly than what they may have in days of old. So we're very lucky to have them, and generally they're well placed throughout the state as well. There's quite a bit of options as far as marketing locally. So we're going to go through just a few tips as far as selling at local auction barns. I talk to auction barn owners fairly often, people that operate livestock auctions, and one thing that they mostly uniformly say is there's a lack of communication between cattle producers and them. You've got to communicate with the owners or the managers. Ask their opinion of market conditions before sending cattle to sale. A lot of times they can tell you what's going on in the markets, what they foresee, whether next week would be a better time or if we should hold off a couple of weeks. Communicate, folks, with these people a couple of weeks in advance. You wean a set of calves and you're backgrounding them 45, 60 days, something like that. Contact them before you wean them. Say, hey, I'm weaning and backgrounding a set of calves. They're going to be ready to go here in a month. A lot of times these sale barn operators can advertise cattle, or if your cattle are a specialty item, they can get word to appropriate buyers, and that really can affect your bottom line. Take time to visit the sale barn on sale day and kind of watch cattle sale. That's hard for the us smaller producers. If we've got normal jobs, if we're working a regular job in town, sometimes it's difficult to make time to go to that sale, but it really can be beneficial. One, you can see how many buyers are active at the sale barn, the types of cattle being sold, what brings a premium and what's discounted. I guarantee you, folks, you sit and watch one sale. If you pay close attention, you'll see what's bringing those premium prices, and alternatively, what's being heavily discounted at market. Ask for the last sales market report or summary. It's unfortunate, folks, that we don't have a USDA market report available for the state of Louisiana. It's really data that we could use, not only producers, but us in the Ag Center, us in Extension, and in research. But we don't, so we have to rely on those self-generated market reports from these local auction markets. So ask for that. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to provide it in a paper copy. I think most all the sale barns in Louisiana post those on social media sites as well, some on their websites. Ask about those upcoming special sales. Weaned or preconditioned calves sales are popular and can potentially bring a premium. Ask them when the next one's going to be. If you're selling cows, replacement quality stocker type cows, most all sale barns have regularly scheduled stocker cow sales. Sometimes they're only a couple a year, but ask about those if you're trying to market those replacement cattle. They can really affect the end price on those cattle. You can visit with your neighbors, the feed store, local ag business, co-ops, things like that, about local auctions and where the best money is being realized at. But you got to take that advice with a grain of salt, folks. One neighbor may have a bad experience, and once you investigate and you kind of dig in, their bad experience at a local sale barn may not be the sale barn's fault. It may be their own fault. Either they didn't have their cattle properly prepped for sale, or they were just using a breed that traditionally brings lower prices at auction. So please take that with a grain of salt. Livestock auctions want your cattle to bring the most money possible. Their commission, it's dependent on it. That's one thing that I think most producers get wrong. You visit with any cattle producer, they'll say, "Oh, don't sell it this barn; they'll cheat you, and they get horrible prices and stuff." Well, there is variation between barns week to week. I can attest to that. But these local livestock auctions want your cattle to bring the most money possible, because that commission that they're charging you is based on those sale prices. So naturally, they want as much money as they can reasonably get out of your cattle. Also, do your research. I'm going to repeat that several times throughout the course of this presentation. Folks, do your research when you're marketing cattle. All right, I'm going to talk briefly about large regional auctions. When I talk about large regional auctions, there are several scattered throughout the country. We don't really have any in Louisiana that would be considered large regionals. Talking about things like the Oklahoma National Stockyards, and there's many others. Distance is crucial, folks, whenever you're talking about marketing these. You visit with a neighbor that markets them, that sells their cattle through a large regional auctions. They may be selling truck loads. They may be selling a large amounts of cattle and enough to overcome that the trucking costs. And I put in here, will the added money you get be negated by those increased trucking costs? Location is critical. Northern auctions, those that are farther north, have little experience and few buyers for our Louisiana Brahman influenced cattle. So if you got those Brahman influenced cattle, they probably need to stay at a larger sale barn or local auction barn in the south or in the southern part of the United States. Think about South Texas, so on and so forth. How do these auctions sell cattle? Some sell them as singles. A lot of them sell them as groups. Some do both. When you're talking about group sales, those cattle have to be uniform. So if you've got a gooseneck load and you're planning on going to a large regional auction and they sell them as singles, and or they sell them as groups, and your cattle are pretty uneven, there a lot of variation in them, it probably is not going to end well. You're probably going to have to find a location that does sell them as singles, like we sell in Louisiana. What kind of cattle and programs bring the biggest money at that auction? That's a very important question. A lot of these large regional auction barns have vaccinated and preconditioned wean cattle programs. They may have a whole litany of programs that help cattle bring more money. Also, what kind of cattle? If they're more English cattle, English cross cattle that are bringing the premium, you got the Brahman influence and they get discounted there, you may want to try to avoid them. I'll mention this and I'll talk about it more as far as cooperatives, but there is a potential to work with other producers to make a truckload. If you've got only 25,000 pounds of steers and the neighbor's got an additional 25,000 pounds and they're fairly uniform, you may want to go in and sell those cattle as a cooperative together. We'll talk more about that here in just a minute. Selling cattle through video or internet marketing markets is a popular way. Is growing in popularity. If you watch any of the large video auctions, you see that it's not uncommon for outfits like Superior Livestock to market 200,000 plus head of cattle through the course of a couple of days on the internet or through video. They're usually, but not always, reserved for truckload lots. Uniformity is critical, folks, as well as working with a reputable company and representative to get those cattle marketed. You've got to know beforehand the conditions of the sale, and you've got to establish those prior to the auction. Things such as shrink, what percentage shrink is going to be assigned on these cattle, what delivery date. If the delivery date is far in the future, what expected weight are you going to sell these calves at? The slide, and what the slide is it's a financial tool to adjust in case your cattle are much heavier or much lighter than what you advertise them and sell them to be. One of the popular options, especially for larger ranches and farms, is selling calf crops whenever they're very young, sometimes just a month or two old. They'll be selling them for weaning, which may be 4 or 5 months in advance. You've got to study your lesson. You've got to know your business. You've got to know what you expect those cattle to come off as, to wean out as. There's huge financial implications. You can sell mixed loads on video auctions, mixed being steers and heifers. They can be discounted though, and it can come with risk. It narrows the buyer's pool down. And alternatively, you can sell a little bit less than a load of cattle, but there may be a freight adjustment. You may have to pay a certain amount to adjust that freight to make it worth the buyer's while to send a truck for 3/4 of a load of cattle, 40,000 pounds or even 37,000 or something like that. So that is something to keep in mind. Selling cattle private treaty, that's old as the industry. That's basically making an agreement between two people or one person, the producer, and the whatever the buyer. It's old as the industry. It requires networking though in the cattle community. Easier done with those heifers. It's harder with steers, and it's very difficult with cow cows and with bulls. It's very easy for us to, let's say that you've got 10 extra heifers that you've weaned off, and your neighbor is looking for some quality replacement heifers, and he likes your genetics, your program. That's an easy sell right there, and it can be very beneficial for all involved. This is a very popular method amongst purebred breeders that are selling registered bulls. We see it a lot in that industry. Relationships are built on trust and may take many calf crops to cultivate, especially when we're talking about selling our steers or our feeder type cattle, even feeder heifers that way. It requires a lot of trust. That buyer's going out on a limb for you. And you're trying to market yourself, not only your calves, but yourself, your farm, the way those calves have been raised. And that leads to the next point. Quality is king, is paramount, folks. If you've got quality cattle, then they're going to be attracted to a buyer private treaty. You have to establish the parameters of the sale before cattle change hands. Are you going to sell them by the head or by the pound? What price point are you going to use? Who's going to haul the cattle? Who's going to transport them? Are you going to factor shrink into the equation? What scales are going to be used? Just a brief note about scales, folks. If you're selling cattle on scales in Louisiana, then those must be certified. You got to certify them through the Department of Agriculture and Forestry, and so that's something to keep in the back of your mind. Have an idea of your cattle's worth. Do your research, folks, when you're trying to establish those price points that I mentioned earlier. There are many tools out there. Cattle Facts, USDA market reports from outside the state. Brief word on that, folks. If you're using USDA market reports to compare prices, always try to use those from maybe Arkansas or Mississippi. Be careful about using statewide averages for Texas, because Texas can traditionally see maybe a little higher prices on auction barn receipts, and that's just a function of transportation costs. When they're closer to where the end point is for the cattle, that means that they're going to be able to give just a slightly more money for them. You can use local sale barn market reports. Use caution with that though, folks, because that doesn't take all the time take quality into account. Whenever you're doing that, put everything together, you can get a pretty good idea of what your cattle is worth though. Internet marketing, I think Tyler talked about board sales and stuff like that. That's going to be, it's an emerging mechanism, method for us to sell our cattle. It's not just for truckloads of cattle though. Several websites do provide a path for selling cattle. And it's all classes of cattle, really. I would say an exception would probably be the cull cows or cull bulls, but maybe they could even be sold there as well. All classes of cattle, from feeder cattle all the way to replacement heifers, stocker cows, pair cattle, everything is sold on these websites. Several out there that can be used. An example of one would be Cattle Range. It's been around quite some time. A lot of folks use it. It's not the only one, though. Be cautious using social media sites, though. That seems like one of the fastest growing marketing methods for cattle. And see a lot of folks, especially smaller scale producers, that are taking advantage of selling their cattle on social media sites. Just be careful, folks. If you're selling animals, it may violate your user agreements, your user agreements related to that social media site. Just use caution on that. And as with private treaty, we didn't really talk about this, but use caution when receiving payment, folks. If it's your neighbor and you trust them and you're willing to take a personal check, that's one thing. If it's somebody 300 miles away that you've never met, is taking a personal check when they pick up the cattle a good idea? Probably not. Be wary of opening yourself up to internet scams. We see this a lot, especially when folks are selling hay, in particular online. It seems like it's really opens you up to a lot of scammers, so to speak. So use caution with that. I'm going to mention retaining ownership at a feedlot through the feeding process, but I'm not going to spend just a ton of time on it because it is mostly used for truckload lots of cattle. It's not for everyone. There is potential for significant financial gains or alternatively huge losses. You got to proceed with caution with this, folks. Brahman influenced cattle should be fed and marketed in feedlots, yards that are experienced with them, usually in the South. Much as with the large regional auctions, folks, you want to keep those cattle. If you're planning on feeding cattle, you're not going to want to send your Brahman influenced steers to northern Kansas, even northern Oklahoma, especially not during February, March, January, so that time period. Things aren't going to end well, folks. You know, the cattle aren't accustomed to the climate, the colder climate. But not only that, the feedlot may not have buyers or may not have an agreement with a beef company, with a processor that will take Brahman influenced cattle. So do your homework on that. As with everything related to cattle marketing, do your research. When you're selecting the feed yard, make sure it's a reputable feed yard. It's crucial to your overall success, folks. Remember, a feedlot is in the business of selling feed. They sell that feed through your cattle, and marketing cattle is a service they offer. But remember, their first line of business is selling that feed. Selling cattle through cooperatives. Simply put, it's grouping similar type, kind, weight cattle together, calves usually, from several sources to make a truckload in order to take advantage of those marketing options. It has been done to some degree of success in the Southeast. I've heard some examples of some very successful cooperatives or groups of folks getting together and selling truckloads of cattle. It can be complex, which requires many producers organized by an outside group, such as a cattlemen's association, a local co-op, so on and so forth. It can involve many producers, or it could be as simple as the example I used earlier, two neighbors getting together and putting a truckload of cattle together. Uniformity and trust is crucial. I would say the trust is huge whenever it comes to selling through a cooperative or grouping together with another producer. Things have to be established beforehand, such as who's going to handle the money, who's going to make the decision on where to send them at, who's going to be the point of contact on this, what's the shipping point going to be, so on and so forth. The list goes on. You can sell through a cooperative using private treaty. I know of several examples of that. in-person auctions, local livestock auctions. I've heard of some cooperative sales at local livestock auctions, retaining ownership through feedlots. That's an old way of doing it. Producers putting their cattle together to send them to feedlots. Internet or video auctions or large regional auctions. Those really and truly everything is available through this cooperative marketing method. It's a simple concept on paper. It's easy for me to lay it out like I did. It's very difficult in real world to put it into practice. Not impossible. It's just difficult. Selling directly to consumers. I'm not going to spend hardly any time on this because we've covered it extensively in past Beef Brunch Educational Series. We've got some really fantastic beef brunch videos focused on selling beef, essentially. Market conditions and input costs can significantly influence this choice. Folks, if you've been in the freezer calf business, especially since 2020 when the market's been bad, you realized that it was a very profitable avenue to market your cattle. If you hadn't done it in the last few months or last 6 months or maybe even a year, you've got to realize though that things have changed just a little bit when it comes to the selling beef directly, folks. Market conditions have changed. We know that feed costs have changed. Study your lesson hard, folks. If you're in the freezer calf business, if you're selling beef directly, study that price point. Make sure that you've got it set to a point where you can make a profit on it. These high prices on calves and yearlings are really putting a lot of pressure on the folks in the beef industry, in the beef direct selling beef industry. I say that because when you see these record calf prices, it sure is a hard decision to say, I'm going to keep those calves another 6 months, get them to a marketable size. You're talking about investing a lot of very high priced inputs in getting those cattle where they need to be. I'm going to end this one up as far as direct selling beef with the question, are you in the cattle business or the beef business or both? I know producers that are in all three of those categories. And I've put that up there to make you realize, folks, that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. What works for the cattle business does not always work best for the beef business and vice versa. So it kind of is a different skill set whenever you talk about marketing your cattle directly to the consumer by selling beef. So some tips, some hints and tricks related to preparing your cattle to sell, adding value to those calves. Jason Holmes and I did a Beef Brunch series a while back that was on a similar topic, and I alluded to some of the things mentioned on this slide in that past one. I encourage you to go back and look on that one. That we really shared some good information, especially what Jason shared as far as interpreting market reports and such. But we'll go through these real briefly. I got a couple of points to make. There is no replacement, folks, for quality genetics as a starting point. Good cattle will always be worth something. That's a quote my grandfather used, and I ascribe to it today. Even in the darkest hours of the markets, when the market cycle is at the absolute bottom, it's a little bit easier, if not a lot easier, to sell those good cattle, and you'll get a premium for them even in a down market. Not meaning to start a whole conversation on breeds. I'm not going to get into that. Louisiana has a whole host of breeds, and we've got almost every breed produced, I think, in the country right here in Louisiana. And we've got some fantastic breed associations and purebred breeders that do a good job advancing their particular breed. But coat color does matter, folks, plain and simple. And simply put, avoid breedings that will yield the spotted or what we call painted cattle in the industry. Avoid those breedings, spotted or painted, that produce spotted or painted calves. Now, we've kind of grown accustomed, the nation as a whole has worked under the assumption that Angus influenced black-hided cattle bring the most money. There are several research studies, and one that I alluded to during that presentation that I mentioned earlier, Jason and I did, there's not as much difference as you may think between the black-hided cattle and those Charolais type white grayish colored hides, yellow-hided cattle. There's not a whole lot of difference, and even solid reds. When you throw solid reds in there, that doesn't really affect the price much at all. Where you see the huge drops, folks, is on those spotted calves or painted calves. And I get asked the question from time to time, well, why is that? Or what about Herefords? And I guess I need to address those individually. We'll start with the Herefords. Herefords traditionally have that white painted spot in their top line above the shoulders and maybe even reaching down a little bit towards the withers. That doesn't affect prices, folks. When you're talking about that, that doesn't really come into play. People know and expect that. Buyers know and expect that from Herefords. What they're the reason why they're heavily discounted is because of the feeder cattle buyers trying to avoid any dairy or Corriente or Longhorn genetics in their feeder cattle. If you see these spotted or painted cattle, it may be a sign that that's present in the genetics on that calf, and they're trying to avoid that, plain and simple. Another tip, and Tyler alluded to this, castrate those calves, folks. That's the single largest, single easiest thing that I see that people avoid whenever they're getting their cattle ready to sell. It can significantly affect your bottom line. Research has shown time and time again that your calves are going to bring 5 cents to 15 cents per pound more, folks, by simply steering those bull calves. It can have a huge impact on your bottom line. And you can talk to any one of us. We'll be more than happy to discuss options as far as steering cattle. It can be very simple if done at the correct time. If you're running cattle that tend to have horns, and I'm not talking about little nub horns when I'm talking about horned cattle. I'm talking about if you're selling calves or yearlings that have pretty significant horns. Simply put, dehorning those cattle can add between 8 cents and 24 cents per pound for that simple aspect of cattle management. Consider implants whenever you're thinking about your marketing strategy. I know a lot of folks, especially those that are selling selling directly to consumers, selling beef, or that are on some kind of all natural program, shy away from those growth hormone implants. But folks, they can yield, old data shows $25 to $40 of added weight gain and thus price to those calves. They can really have a big impact whenever you market those calves. Proper herd health. We know that keeping up with our deworming, our vaccinations, our general herd health can boost weaning weights and thus boost our sale prices. I mentioned earlier talking about local livestock auctions and large regionals that they have preconditioned calf sales. So there's some older Texas A&M data that showed that preconditioned calves during preconditioned sales can average almost $70 more per calf. Ashley, whenever she asked me to deliver this talk, she asked me to mention something about cull cows and bulls. And folks, I started to include quite a bit of information on it, but I really think that this topic bears splitting out, and maybe in the future we can have a whole topic on Beef Brunch related to marketing those cull animals, because there's more to it than what you think. But I'll say this, my one comment on selling those cull cows and cull bulls, folks, sell them before they're walking death. Get those cattle gone before they're set to expire. We all have done it. We've been guilty of keeping cows too long, trying to squeeze that one more calf out of them, are trying to get one more season out of that bull. And we know the risk that's associated with it, especially when you're on a fall calving system and you keep those older cows, those thinner type cows, those that are reaching the end of their productive lifespan. We know that we need to get them gone and such. We know the risk when it comes to keeping bulls past their prime, risk of not getting our cows bred in an appropriate fashion or having a high conception rate. But main thing, just sell them for their walking death. Sell at the proper time for all classes of cattle, but when though? That's a often asked question. This slide, I have a graph from Cattle Facts on 550-pound steer prices. Now, remember, folks, this is nationwide prices, okay? So it may not necessarily reflect what's going on locally in Louisiana. Also, keep in mind, these are expressed as dollars per hundredweight, not dollars per pound. So keep that in mind. The black line you see is 2023, and we know if you marketed cattle throughout 2023, you've seen that increase that is represented by that black line. But we're not going to pay so much attention to that because 2023 may be an outlying year. Pay real close attention to that red dotted line, folks. That's a 10-year average when it comes to those 550-pound steer prices. And you'll notice that as we're coming out of January at the start of the new year, we start seeing climbs, and that we really get to the top of the market, so to speak, as far as the year, somewhere around that April 1 time frame. And between April 1, as we get into those more summer months of May, we start seeing declines, and there's some ebbs and flows in the market as we go through summer. And then look at where we're at today. Look kind of around Labor Day and beyond, from that September to October time frame. We just bottom out, folks. And I get asked a lot whenever I present this chart, this graph. Why is that? Why do you see such a precipitous drop in the fall? And it's all centered, folks, on breeding seasons. Think about when the vast majority of the cattle in the United States are calved. Most of them are spring calving. So naturally, whenever you have a calf born in the spring, you're going to wean it this time of the year. That's when you have a huge influx, a huge rush of these freshly weaned calves into market is starting in late August, September, all the way down into October. And you'll notice if you can get past that mid-October point, on a 10-year average, we start to see some climbs in prices. We start to see some improvement there. Folks, this chart is a good representation of why we push fall calving system a lot in extension and a lot within the LSU Ag Center. Let's just assume that you're fall calving, that your calves are being born sometime September, October, November. Think about when you're going to wean those cattle. You're going to wean them close to May. Look at how that market is performing then. And this chart doesn't mean a whole lot, though, if you're retaining ownership. If you're calving in the spring, you're weaning them this time of year in September, and you're holding those cattle over, grazing them on ryegrass or wheat, then you're flipping the script, so to speak, and you're able to take advantage of those March through May high prices. So we're a big fan of keeping those calves, grazing them on ryegrass when possible or wheat, and taking advantage of those the market increases. This is a utility grade cull cow price chart from Cattle Facts as well. And same thing as with those 550-pound calves. Take notice of what that 10-year average, that red dotted line, is showing us. We start to get those best prices as we move into April, and we start seeing a climb a little bit up until around Labor Day, around that September mark, and then we also see that precipitous decline. And we know that a lot of folks, it's a very popular method in management to palpate cows this time of year. and rightfully so. You know, things have started cooling down. You're prepping your herd for winter, but just know that if you're palpating cows and if you're planning on selling those open or old or unproductive members of the herd, that we start seeing these declines in these cull cow prices. We've started seeing it a little bit this year. Even if you look at that black line, you'll see that we're starting to see some declines as far as those cull cow prices go. And so that is all I have, folks. There's each one of these topics that I've discussed, folks, can be split apart. We can make an individual Beef Brunch Educational Series on any of these topics. I would say the market's good right now. It's hard to do wrong as far as marketing cattle in an up market. But remember what I said. Remember those lessons of 2015, folks. Remember that it won't always be this good, and that we need to think carefully when we're preparing our cattle to sell, preparing our calves to sell, and also how we're choosing our marketing venues. I say this a lot in the course of talks and videos and such, but educate yourself, folks. Don't let your knowledge end whenever the person from the sale barn shows up and closes the trailer gates on your calves, or when you get that check. Educate yourself on the industry as a whole, on cattle marketing. Keep your eyes open. Try to become more knowledgeable about the industry as a whole, because it can definitely affect your bottom line. That being said, Brittany, that's all I've got, and I guess open it up to any questions.
Okay, thank you, Lee. I'm checking our Q&A and as well as the text messages, and I'm not seeing any questions. But that's okay. I mean, I guess if people have questions, they can always put them in our, on our YouTube channel maybe later on, and they can contact you as well. So thank you, Lee, again for your time today. If anyone does have any questions, if you're viewing this later on, Lee's contact info is up there on the screen if you would like to reach out to him. So this will conclude our webinar series this fall on cattle marketing. So thank you to Lee and all of our presenters throughout this series. So if there is a topic that you would like to see covered on our next Beef Brunch webinar series, please reach out to Dr. Ashley Edwards. So we'll be posting this recording online within the next week or so. So it can be found on our YouTube channel, which is the LSU Ag Center Livestock YouTube channel. It will also be on the Beef Brunch webpage, which is lsuagcenter.com/beefbrunch under past webinars. And more information will be on our Beef Brunch website. And lastly, if you have any other questions regarding the Beef Brunch Educational Series, you can contact Dr. Ashley Edwards at akedwards@agcenter.lsu.edu. Thank you for your time and have a great day.